Nellie Ashford stepped down from the stagecoach holding a wooden box tighter than her own trunk. The driver dropped her luggage into the dust of Cinder Creek and did not offer to lift it again. His eyes moved over her travel-worn dress. The old mark near her jaw. The flour dust still caught in one sleeve. And then away. As if he had already decided she was not the kind of woman worth helping. "End of the road," he said. Nellie nodded. She did not ask him for anything. The box in her arms was warm from her body. Inside it, wrapped in cloth and tucked inside a glass jar, her sourdough starter still breathed in small bubbles. It had crossed 3,000 miles with her. It had survived train smoke, hard benches, cheap rooms, stale air. And every morning she had woken afraid that the past had found her. It was still alive. That mattered. Cinder Creek did not look like a place that welcomed second chances. The buildings leaned toward the muddy main road. A dog slept beneath the general store steps. Two women outside the mercantile stopped talking when they saw Nellie. Then began again in voices meant to be heard. "Poor thing," one said. The other answered. "Poor is one word for it." Nellie kept walking. She had learned that stopping gave people permission to watch the words land. So she lifted her trunk, balanced the wooden box against her ribs, and followed the road toward the low hill where Harlow Ranch waited. The ranch looked tired before she reached the gate. The fences sagged. The barn door hung crooked. Grass grew in the wagon track. The house itself had good bones. But grief had settled over it, like dust no broom had touched in years. A man came out of the barn. Grant Harlow was broad-shouldered, weather-cut, and silent in a way that made the yard feel even larger. He looked at her box first, then at her face. "You're the baker." "Nellie Ashford," she said. "I bake. I cook. I keep a clean kitchen. And I do not cause trouble unless trouble has already entered the room." Something unreadable passed through his eyes. "My telegram said wages, room, and board." "It did," Nellie said. "Then we have an agreement." He watched her for another breath, then turned toward the house. "Kitchen's this way." The kitchen was worse than the yard. The stove was black with old burn marks. Flour sat open in barrels that had not been protected. Dishes leaned in the basin. The shelves had no order. The whole room smelled of smoke, spoiled water, and a sorrow no one had named because naming it would require doing something after. Grant stood in the doorway. "Last cook left months ago." Nellie set the wooden box on the cleanest patch of counter she could find. "I'll need sealed flour, fresh salt, sugar, dish towels, and lard. The stove needs stripping and reseasoning before I bake anything meant for people." "How many am I feeding?" Grant blinked once, as if he had expected tears. "3. Me. My man Miles. My daughter." Nellie paused. "How old?" 8. "What is her name?" His jaw tightened. "Minnie." The name came out carefully, like a cup already cracked. "She does not speak," Grant said. "Hasn't for 2 years. You do not question her. You do not chase her. You do not try to fix her." Nellie held his gaze. "I do not fix children," she said. "I feed people. Sometimes that is enough for the first day." He left before answering. Nellie rolled up her sleeves. For hours, she scrubbed, hauled water, cleared shelves, burned spoiled scraps, sealed what could be saved, and made the stove black and honest again. By sunset, the kitchen no longer smelled abandoned. It smelled like smoke, swap, beans, and the beginning of bread. That night, while the ranch settled into uneasy quiet, Nellie opened the wooden box and fed the starter. A small sound came from the doorway. She did not turn too quickly. A girl stood there in a dress too short at the hem. Dark eyes fixed on the bubbling jar. "Hello, Minnie," Nellie said gently, looking at the starter instead of the child. "This is older than both of us. It only stays alive if someone remembers to feed it." Minnie said nothing, but she stayed. The next morning, Nellie woke before the house knew it was morning. Old habits had sharp teeth. She had spent too many years learning to rise before anyone could accuse her of laziness. And even in a strange room with a door that latched from the inside, her body still obeyed fear before reason could speak. She dressed in the dark, tied her hair back, and went to the kitchen. The starter had risen overnight. That made her smile before she remembered she was alone. She lit the stove, warmed water, measured flour, and began the first loaves for Harlow Ranch. Bread was honest work. It did not care what a woman looked like, what name she had dark left behind, or whether the town had laughed when she stepped off a coach. It asked for flour, water, salt, time, and hands willing to stay with it. Be done. The kitchen smelled different. Not fixed. Not healed. But awake. Grant came in while the first loaves cooled on the table. He stopped in the doorway as if he had walked into the wrong house. His eyes moved from the clean stove to the stacked dishes, then to the bread. Nellie set a plate in front of him. Eggs, potatoes, coffee, and one thick slice still warm enough to soften butter. He sat without comment. That was fine. Nellie had never trusted quick praise. He ate slowly. When he finished, he carried his own plate to the basin. She noticed. Before he left, he paused near the door. "Bread's good." Then he was gone. Those two words stayed in the kitchen after him. Miles O'Rourke arrived later, cheerful and hungry, and declared the room a miracle before he had even sat down. "Miss Nellie," he said after his third piece of bread, "you are going to ruin us." "How so?" "We will expect food to taste alive every day now." "That sounds like a problem for your expectations." Miles laughed loud enough to reach the hallway. A small shadow moved there. Nellie saw it without turning her head. Minnie stood just beyond the doorframe. One hand curled into her skirt, dark eyes fixed on the bread. Nellie kept wiping the counter. "There is a plate on the table," she said lightly, as if speaking to the flour. "No one has to eat it now. Food waits better than people do." Miles looked toward the doorway, but Nellie caught his eye and shook her head once. He understood. By the time Nellie turned around, Minnie was gone. The plate was gone too. That evening, Nellie left supper for her again. Potatoes, beans, bread with honey, and warm milk. She did not call. She did not ask. She only worked at the sink and listened. Small feet crossed the floor. A chair scraped. For several minutes, the kitchen held its breath. Then the chair moved back. When Nellie looked, the plate was empty. She told no one. The next night, it happened again. And the next. By the end of the week, Minnie no longer vanished as quickly. She lingered beside the table, watching Nellie feed the starter. "It bubbles because it is alive," Nellie said, keeping her eyes on the jar. "My grandmother kept it before me. Her mother before her. It has survived more kitchens than either of us has seen." Minnie stared at the jar. Nellie lowered her voice. "Some living things only need to be fed quietly until they remember how to rise." Minnie did not speak, but she came back the next morning. On Sunday, Nellie found cinnamon in a sealed tin at the back of the pantry. The smell nearly undid her. For a moment, she was a girl again in her grandmother's kitchen. Before fear learned her name, she stood with both hands on the counter until the feeling passed. Then rolled the dough thin. Spread butter, cinnamon, and sugar, and cut the soft spiral rounds one by one. When the rolls came from the oven, the whole kitchen changed. Sweet warmth filled the room. Even the old walls seemed to breathe it in. Minnie appeared in the doorway. Not hiding this time. Standing. Nellie placed one roll on a plate and set it at the table. "They are better warm," she said to the counter. "But they will still be here if you would rather wait." She turned back to the pan. The chair scraped. A long silence followed. Then, softer than the stove settling, came a voice. "Thank you." Nellie's hand stopped above the icing. She did not turn. She did not gasp. She did not make the child carry the weight of being a miracle. She only breathed once. Steady and slow. "You're welcome," Nellie said. To the pan. To the counter. To the ordinary morning air. Behind her, Minnie finished the roll and slipped away. Only then did Nellie press both hands flat against the table and let the tears come. Not because the house was healed. Because something inside it had chosen to live. After the cinnamon roll, Minnie began coming to the kitchen as if she were approaching a creek in winter. Carefully, one step at a time. She did not speak every day. Some mornings, she only sat at the table and watched Nellie knead dough. Other mornings, she touched the glass jar where the starter lived. Then pulled her hand back quickly, as if the bubbles might judge her for wanting to know them. Nellie never pushed. She talked while she worked. "This dough is too tight," she said one morning, pressing the heel of her palm into the soft round. "Means it needs rest. People are like that sometimes. If you work them too hard, they stop becoming what they were meant to be." Minnie watched. "Does bread get tired?" she asked. Nellie kept her hands moving, though her heart lifted at the sound. "Yes," she said. "But good tired is different from broken tired." Minnie thought about that for a long while. Then she climbed onto the stool beside the counter. "Can I help?" Nellie handed her a wooden spoon without making the moment too large. "Stir slow. Bread does not like being rushed." From then on, the kitchen changed by inches. Minnie learned to measure flour with both hands steady. She learned to press dough and feel when it was ready. She learned that salt mattered even when you could not see it. She learned that heat could ruin a loaf if no one watched it closely. And slowly, Grant Harlow learned to stand in his own kitchen again. The first evening he found Minnie on the stool, folding cornbread batter under Nellie's quiet instruction. He stopped in the doorway, like a man seeing a ghost and a sunrise at the same time. Minnie's spoon faltered. Nellie did not look away from the bowl. "Keep stirring," she said. "Even circles." "That's right." Grant stood there for a breath too long. Then he crossed the room and sat down. He said nothing. But when Minnie carried her own plate to the table that night and sat across from him instead of taking supper upstairs, Grant reached for the cornbread with a hand that was not entirely steady. Nellie pretended not to notice. The next morning, she found a small purple wildflower beside the starter jar. Its stem had been tucked into a crack in the wood so it would stand upright. Nellie looked at it for a long time. When Minnie came in, Nellie said only, "Thank you." Minnie's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but something brave enough to become one later. Miles O'Rourke noticed everything and wisely made jokes about none of it. Instead, he brought butter from a cousin's dairy, clean sacks of flour from town, and news from the general store. "Tessa Harrow says those loaves you sent with me sold before noon," he said one afternoon, Railroad men bought half. Miners bought the rest. She wants more. Nellie wiped flour from her wrist. How much more? As much as you can bake. That was how the bread business began. Not with a sign. Not with a plan. Just extra loaves wrapped in cloth and sent into Cinder Creek with Miles. By the next week, Tessa had cleared a space on the general store counter. By the week after that, the hotel wanted a standing order. Grant watched the coins come back in a small tin. You should keep that, he said. I pay for flour and use of the kitchen first. Nellie answered. Then I keep what is mine. He looked at her as if the word mine mattered. Maybe it did. For the first time in years, Nellie had money that no one had taken from her hand before she could count it. Then trouble found the counter at Tessa Harrow's store. Nellie was tying twine around a flour sack when a man near the door went still. Well? He said softly. Eleanor Graves. The name struck her like cold water. She turned. Clem Voss leaned against the wall, smiling with the ease of a man who enjoyed finding weakness. My name is Nellie Ashford, she said. Is it now? Clem stepped closer. Victor Ellery has been looking all over for you. Says you ran off with something valuable. I took nothing that belonged to him. Clem's smile thinned. There is a reward. The store went quiet. Nellie felt every eye turn toward her. She thought of Minnie's flour. Grant's silent kitchen. The starter still breathing in its jar. She did not step back. How much? She asked. Clem blinked. Enough. I will pay you more. Nellie said. But you give me time. His eyes sharpened. How much time? Nellie lifted her chin. 45 days. Clem studied her. Then smiled again. Then bake fast. Eleanor. He left the store laughing softly. Nellie stood still until the door closed. Then she picked up the flour sack. Because fear could wait. Bread could not. Nellie began waking before the rooster. Then, before the moon had fully lowered. Then, at hours so dark, even the stove seemed reluctant to be useful. She baked 6 loaves for the ranch. Then 12 for Tessa Harrow's counter. Then more for the hotel. Then sweet rolls for the miners who had learned to ask what day the Harlow bread arrived. She kneaded until her shoulders burned. She wrapped split knuckles in cloth and kept going. She slept in pieces and woke already counting. Clem Voss had given her 45 days. $1,000 was not money to Nellie. It was distance. Distance from Victor Ellery. Distance from the name Eleanor Graves. Distance from a house where every room had taught her to make herself smaller. Miles noticed first. You look like a woman trying to outwork a flood, he said, leaning in the kitchen doorway. I am. That is not an encouraging answer. Nellie slid loaves into the oven. Then stop asking questions you do not want answered. Miles raised both hands and wisely retreated. Minnie noticed next. The child sat on her stool, watching Nellie shape dough with fingers wrapped in white cloth. Your hands are hurt. They are working hands. They are bleeding. They are bleeding working hands. Minnie frowned. That does not make sense. Most necessary things don't. Until later. For a while. Minnie was quiet. Then she asked, Are you in trouble? Nellie stopped pressing the dough. The old instinct rose first. Deny. Smile. Make it soft. Protect the child from the weight. But Minnie had lived inside silence for 2 years. She knew when adults lied by kindness. A little. Nellie said. Minnie's eyes grew serious. Can Papa help? He already is. He gives me a kitchen. Wages. Flour. And a door that closes. That is not the same. No. Nellie admitted. It is not. By the fourth week, Nellie had almost enough. Almost was a cruel word. She stood over a pot of stew one morning, stirring long after it needed stirring. When Grant came in from checking the east pasture. "You are swaying," he said. "I am standing. Badly." He crossed the kitchen and took the spoon from her hand. Not roughly. Not gently either. Simply with the calm certainty of a man removing a sharp tool from someone too tired to hold it safely. "When did you last sleep a whole night?" Nellie looked away. "I need $300. Grant said nothing. She hated the silence. Hated needing anything. Hated that her body had betrayed her before her plan could finish. "It is a loan," she said quickly. "I can pay it back from the bread orders. I only need time." "How much is the whole debt?" "1,000. To Kleinvoss." Her head snapped up. Grant's face was still. "Miles told me enough to worry. Not enough to betray you." Nellie's hands curled at her sides. "It is not your burden." "No," Grant said. "But this house is no longer built, so every person carries a loan." That struck harder than kindness. He went to his office and returned with bills counted clean and exact. 300, he said. "Against future profits. Written in the ledger if you want it." Nellie stared at the money. If he had offered pity, she could have refused. If he had made himself her rescuer, she could have walked out. But he offered terms, respectable ones. Ones that let her stand upright while accepting help. "Write it," she said. So he did. 5 days before the deadline. Nellie met Clem Voss at Tessa Harrow's store. She counted every dollar on the counter. Clem smiled as he took it. "Victor never did understand what you were worth." Nellie looked him in the eye. "Do not say his name like it still owns the room." His smile faltered. "And if you speak of me to him," she continued, "then every town between here and Boston will hear that Clem Voss took money from a woman running from a controlling man. Then sold her anyway." Tessa Harrow stopped pretending to arrange canned peaches. Clem looked at her. Then at the money. Then back at Nellie. "You have changed." "Yes," Nellie said. "That was the point." He left. When Nellie walked back to Harlow Ranch, her pockets were empty. But the road felt more solid beneath her boots. For 6 weeks, the bread business grew. She repaid Grant every dollar. Minnie laughed more often. Miles ate lunch in the kitchen and claimed it was for convenience. Grant began asking Nellie about supply orders. Pasture repairs. Even whether the east fence was worth saving. Then Tessa Harrow spoke a new name in town. Monroe Kincaid. A land buyer with railroad money behind him. A man purchasing ranches before owners understood why their water suddenly became uncertain. 3 days later, Kincaid rode up the Harlow Ranch drive in a dark suit too clean for honest work. Nellie watched from the kitchen window as Grant met him near the barn. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. She knew the posture of a man trying to steal something while calling it business. Monroe Kincaid stayed at Harlow Ranch for less than half an hour. When he left, the whole yard seemed colder. Grant came into the kitchen with his hat still in his hand and the look of a man who had been told the floor beneath him no longer belonged to him. Nellie poured coffee and set it down. "What did he want?" she asked. "The ranch." Miles looked up from the table. "He offered $15,000. Miles gave a low whistle. "That is not an offer. That is an insult wearing a clean shirt." Grant did not smile. "He says the railroad is coming through. Says smart men sell before the line is marked, and stubborn men regret waiting." Nellie sat across from him. "And the threat?" Grant looked at her. "He says there is a county filing from 1867 that puts creek access under public jurisdiction. Says, if I cannot prove water rights, I cannot run cattle. If I cannot run cattle, I cannot keep the ranch. Miles swore under his breath. Nellie went still. What year was this land first granted? Grant frowned. Before my grandfather was grown. I do not know the exact year. Do you have the original land grant? Somewhere. My father kept papers in the office. Or the storage room. Or any box he happened to be standing near when he got tired of holding them. Find it. Nellie said. Grant stared at her. My father worked in a land office. She said. I grew up reading deeds. Grants. Filings. Water clauses. Boundary disputes. If your original grant predates that county filing and includes water rights, Kincaid is bluffing. For the first time that day, Grant looked less lost. That night, after Minnie went to bed, they searched. Grant opened desk drawers filled with tax receipts, old letters, cattle bills, and photographs turned face down. Miles hauled boxes from the storage room. Nellie worked by lamplight, sorting paper by date, not sentiment. At midnight, Miles called from the back room. Found something heavy enough to matter. The land grant was wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a trunk. Nellie carried it to the lamp with both hands. The paper was thick, aged, and marked with an old seal. The date read 1851. The grant gave the land to Grant's great-grandfather and his heirs. More importantly, it named all natural and established water sources on the property to be held in perpetuity. Nellie read that line aloud twice. Grant stood so still he might have been afraid to breathe near it. In perpetuity, she said. That means Kincaid's filing cannot take your creek. Grant took the paper from her like it was a living thing. The next morning, he and Miles rode to the county office and filed the grant publicly. When they returned, Grant's face told Nellie it had not ended there. Kincaid was waiting. He said. He wants a meeting tomorrow at the Brass Lantern Hotel. Miles crossed his arms. That sounds like a trap. It is. Nellie said. So we go in knowing it. The next day, Kincaid sat in the hotel dining room with white linen under his hands and confidence in every button of his coat. Mr. Harlow, he said. Miss Ashford. Mr. O'Rourke. How democratic. Grant remained standing. Say what you came to say. Kincaid unfolded a document. Your father borrowed $2,500 in 1882. 6% interest. Compounded annually. Never discharged. Current debt is $41,673. Silence dropped over the table. Grant's face lost color. Nellie looked at the paper. Too clean. Too even. The ink sat wrong, shining faintly where old ink should have sunk into fiber. Kincaid smiled. Sell me the ranch for $20,000. And I will settle the debt. Nellie lifted her eyes. That note is not right. Kincaid's smile thinned. Careful. Miss Ashford. No. She said. You be careful. Paper tells stories. And this one is trying too hard. He stood, buttoning his coat. You have until the end of September. After he left, Grant sat heavily. If that debt stands, I lose everything. Nellie folded her hands on the table. Then we find the record he does not want us to see. Miles leaned closer. The bank will not open files for us. No. Nellie said. Not willingly. Grant looked at her for a long moment. What are you suggesting? Nellie looked toward the hotel window, where Cinder Creek moved outside like nothing had changed. I am suggesting we stop walking at the wall, she said, and find the door. That night, Nellie did not bake to forget fear. She baked to keep her hands steady. 4 loaves cooled beside the starter jar while Grant, Miles, and Nellie sat around the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. No one spoke loudly. The house seemed to understand that something dangerous had entered their lives wearing a fine suit and carrying clean paper. Miles had found a door. A janitor at Cinder Creek Bank owed him a favor. Mateo Ortega had keys. A sick child. And no love for Monroe Kincaid. He would not steal. He would not lie. But for one quiet hour after closing, he would let them look where honest people had been told not to look. Grant hated it. Nellie did too. But losing the ranch to a false debt was only a slower kind of theft. They entered the bank after dark with a covered lamp and a camera borrowed from Tessa Harrow. Nellie moved through old files the way another woman might move through a recipe. Date. Name. Ledger. Match. Verify. Grant found the folder first. Harlow Property History. His hands shook when he opened it. Inside was the original promissory note from 1882. Same amount. Same bank. Same family name. But across the front, in faded red ink, was one word. Satisfied. Under it, a clerk had written that the debt had been discharged in full in 1891. Grant stared at the page. My father paid it. Nellie lifted the camera. Yes, she said. And Kincaid knew no one would think to look. They photographed the note, the ledger page, the folder label, and the discharge entry. They put every paper back exactly where it had been. But as they reached the rear door, a voice came from the front office. Looking for something. Miss Ashford. Monroe Kincaid stood beneath the bank lamp with 2 men behind him. He smiled at Grant. This is criminal. No, Nellie said, holding the camera against her chest. What you did is criminal. This is proof. Kincaid's smile did not vanish. But it tightened. You think a woman with a borrowed camera can frighten me? No, Nellie said. But a woman with photographs. A filed land grant. A discharged note. A banker's ledger. And witnesses can become very inconvenient. Miles stepped beside her. Grant stood on the other side. For the first time, Kincaid looked past them toward the street, as if he could already hear the story traveling. By morning, Tessa Harrow had seen the photographs. So had the county clerk. So had 2 ranchers Kincaid had tried to pressure into selling. By noon, the bank president reopened the old file in front of witnesses and entered the discharge into the current record. By evening, Kincaid's lawyer sent a letter. The debt claim was withdrawn. The water claim was withdrawn. The bank would certify the Harlow record as clear. No apology came with it. Men like Kincaid rarely gave apologies when exposure would do. But the consequences came anyway. The Greer family refused his revised offer. The Kimball brothers delayed their sale. 2 railroad buyers who had been meeting with him asked for copies of every title he had touched. For the first time since he arrived in Cinder Creek, Monroe Kincaid had to explain himself instead of frightening other people into silence. That was enough. But the past had one more hand to play. Victor Ellery arrived at Harlow Ranch 3 days later. He came in a black coat, holding a court paper from Massachusetts and calling Nellie by the name she had buried. Eleanor Graves, he said. You are coming home. Minnie stood behind Grant on the porch. Miles waited near the barn. Tessa Harrow had ridden out with 2 witnesses the moment she heard Victor was in town. Grant stepped forward. Nellie touched his arm once. Then she stepped ahead of him. My name is Nellie Ashford. Victor smiled coldly. You do not get to decide that. Yes, she said. I do. She held up the same camera. There are witnesses here. There are records in Boston. There are people who saw what you called marriage. If you try to drag me east, I will make sure every newspaper between here and Massachusetts prints the story you cannot afford to have told." Victor looked from face to face. No one looked away. Not Miles. Not Tessa. Not Grant. Not even Minnie. Then Minnie stepped down from the porch. Her voice was small, but it carried. "She is Nellie," the child said. "And she is staying." Victor's face changed. Not because a child frightened him. Because the silence he expected had become a yard full of witnesses. He folded the paper slowly. "This is not finished." Nellie held his gaze. "For me, it is." Victor left with his pride wounded worse than any court could manage. The ranch did not cheer. It breathed. A week later, a letter arrived from an attorney in Boston. Tessa read it aloud in the kitchen because Nellie's hands were too floury and Grant's were too tense. Victor would not pursue the order. He would not come west again. He used colder words than that. But the meaning was clear. Nellie was no longer running. Months later, a stone bakery stood beside the old kitchen. Nellie hired Dora Finch and Rosie Tate. Women who needed wages more than pity. Every loaf sold from that oven carried more than flour and salt. It carried proof that a woman could build something after being told she was only allowed to survive quietly. Minnie became official taster and wrote labels in careful letters. Miles claimed raisin rolls were too important to trust to children. Minnie told him, very clearly, that he was wrong. One summer morning, Tessa Harrow nailed a painted sign above the bakery door. "Harlow Bread and Hearth. Nellie Ashford. Baker." Minnie stood beneath it and read every word aloud. Nellie had to turn away for a moment. Grant did not ask if she was crying. He only stood beside her. Close enough that she could lean if she chose. Far enough that she did not have to. That evening, Grant found her by the starter jar. "I do not need a cook," he said. "I know. I do not need a mother for Minnie. I know that too." He took off his hat. "I need you. Not hidden. Not useful. Not grateful. Just you. If you will have me." Nellie looked toward the bakery, where Minnie was laughing over a crooked loaf and Miles was pretending not to eat the broken pieces. Then she looked back at Grant. "I will," she said, "but I keep the bakery." Grant smiled. "I would not dare argue." The wedding came in autumn. After the first cool wind moved through Cinder Creek. There was no grand church crowd. No polished announcement. No woman whispering that Nellie had been lucky to be chosen. They stood in the yard between the ranch house and the bakery, with flowers still dusting Nellie's sleeve and Minnie holding a bunch of dried wildflowers tied with kitchen twine. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, Miles looked around the yard. "Anyone foolish enough to object can do it without supper," he said. Minnie laughed first. Then everyone else did. Nellie took Grant's hand. Not because she needed shelter. Not because she needed a name. Because for the first time in her life, she could choose both and still remain herself. That winter, the starter jar sat in the bakery window. Children pressed their noses to the glass to watch the bubbles rise. Travelers bought bread before leaving town. Women who needed work came through Nellie's door and found wages, not pity. And every morning, Minnie wrote the day's loaves on the board in a clear, steady hand. Sourdough, honey rolls, cinnamon bread, raisin rolls. If Miles behaved, Nellie would read the board, touch the starter jar, and feel the quiet truth of it settle inside her. The thing she had carried across the country had not been the last living thing that trusted her. It had been the first. In the window, the starter bubbled softly, still alive, still rising. And this time, So was she? This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.